The news came out on Sunday night that Saudi Arabia had announced a surprise cut. I think it was 500,000 barrels a day from oil production. And there were some other cuts that had already been announced, but this was quite a surprise to the markets. I think it sent the price of oil up about $5 a barrel. I'm watching the oil market. Oil's about $81 a barrel right now. So the market's caught off guard by this. And I think more so than the markets, it was probably the Biden administration that was surprised by this action, because it really is a slap in the face to the United States from the Saudis, because they clearly know that this is not what the Biden administration wants. I mean, first of all, Biden has talked about the fact that he wants to try to buy back some of the oil that they sold. They dramatically, depleted the strategic petroleum reserve. They sold, I think, more than half of the reserves. And Biden has mentioned that he wants to buy it back. And to me, it seems that if I was Saudi Arabia and I knew the United States was going to buy all this oil, I wouldn't want to sell it to them cheap. I mean, if I was Saudi Arabia and I had all this valuable oil in the ground, why take it out of the ground so that the United States could buy it and store it? Just leave it in the ground, right? Don't transfer your valuable oil to the United States. Just don't pump it. And if the United States really wants to buy that oil, make them pay up for it. I think the only way that we're going to refill the tank in the strategic petroleum reserve is if we lose money on the trade. There's no way that the United States is going to buy back that oil cheaper than it sold it. I mean, in a way, the U.S. is short oil, right? Because we sold all this oil that, in theory, we're supposed to buy back. So we got to buy all this oil back. So really, the Saudis are doing a short squeeze on the United States, saying, hey, you want to buy this oil back? Well, you're going to pay a lot of money for it. You're not going to get it back cheaper than when you sold it. So that's one aspect of it. But it really is the Saudis, giving the middle finger to the United States. But they're doing it another way, too, in that the Federal Reserve is now, between a rock and a hard place with its supposed inflation fight on the one hand, and now it's got a financial crisis on the other hand, banking crisis, whatever you want to talk about it. And these policies seem to be, at odds with one another, because in order to fight inflation, they need tight money. But in order to bail out the financial sector, they need easy money. Well, how do you have tight money and easy money at the same time? Seems like you can't really do that. But now having a big spike in oil prices really complicates the Fed's mission, because clearly if oil prices are going up, that's going to show up in the CPI. Now, some people might think, well, okay, that's the headline number. They're more concerned about the core. Well, they're actually concerned about both. But even if you just think about the core, it's not like higher oil prices aren't going to, bleed into the core, because pretty much everything has energy as a cost component. So even if you're not focusing on energy directly, which you would when you look at the headline number, all of the products, goods and services that are in the core are going to have energy factored into the cost structure that is helping to determine those prices. So there's no way this is not going to have an effect on consumer prices, and it's going to have a upward effect at a time where the Fed is hoping that consumer prices go down. But that's not going to happen, and higher oil prices complicates that. But again, it really highlights what we've been watching, and I've been talking about this for weeks, in fact, more than weeks, is how the world is really kind of acting in ways that are directly contrary to America's interest. As the world looks to de-dollarize, to move away from the US dollar as the reserve currency, this is something that I have been saying was inevitable for years. In fact, my entire investment thesis has been predicated on the eventuality that this would happen to the dollar. And in fact, when Biden made the mistake of imposing the sanctions on Putin, I specifically called out the risks that the U.S. was taking with respect to highlighting why the world needed to reject the U.S. dollar. Because there already was enough reasons, economic reasons, why the world should not continue to extend this exorbitant privilege to the United States, and why doing so was such a massive burden on the global economy. But now, or when that happened, Biden gave the world another political reason why they needed to reject the dollar and get out of the system, and that was to avoid the potential of sanctions. I talked about it like you got a rope and you put one half, you put a noose around your neck and then you throw it over a tree, and the other side you give to the United States, right? And just hope they don't pull on the rope. That's really what the world is doing with the U.S. dollar. They're putting themselves in a very vulnerable position, and they're trusting that the United States government doesn't take advantage of it. Well, clearly, with respect to Russia, we pulled that rope. And so that was an example of why the world would want to move away from this. We basically told Saudi Arabia or China, you idiots, you got to get away from the dollar, because look what we just did to Russia. You could be next. And so ever since then, I think the world has been moving faster to get away from the dollar. And we've seen all of these news announcements coming out, bilateral trade deals between Brazil and China, peace treaties being negotiated between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by China. Russia and China, all of our so-called adversaries are now working in concert with one another to reduce their dependence on the U.S. dollar. And this, unilateral surprise move to reduce oil production, when Biden is basically, begging the world to produce more oil. He didn't want us to produce the oil, but he certainly wants Saudi Arabia to produce it. And the Saudis don't care about what America wants. They are doing what they want, and so they are reducing their production. But this idea that the world is rejecting the dollar and moving away from the dollar, it's now gone beyond, the Peter Schiff Show podcast or a few other, fringe type guys, fearmongers, gloom and doomers, how they describe me. The dollar's role as a reserve currency and how greatly the prospects of losing that status are now, upon us based on these events that we're witnessing, but also what it means, the widespread poverty that would ensue from the loss of this privilege. Because unlike most commentators, Tucker Carlson focused on the fact that we depend on the dollar's strength for our standard of living. People take for granted all the goods that we're able to buy that we did not produce. The production is the hard part. The consumption is the easy part. How is it that Americans get to consume without having to do the hard part and produce? Well, because we produce dollars, right? We print money, and the rest of the world wants that money because it's the reserve currency, and so they have to produce real stuff to get it. We don't have to produce anything. We just print it. We don't even print it. We just concoct it out of thin air, with X's and O's or whatever, computer digits. And so that is the secret to our prosperity right now. That's how we've been able to enjoy the standard of living that we have, despite the fact that we have not been as productive. We don't have the factories and the infrastructure and the supply chain that we used to have. We owe that standard of living to the dollar's role as a reserve currency. And if the dollar loses that position, then the entire standard of living that it supported comes collapsing down.